Have you ever wondered how a 30-second morning routine could escalate into a full-blown opera performance? Today's story about neighborly warfare shows just how creative people can get when pushed to their limits.
That's quite an intriguing setup. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, picture this, a 28-year-old coffee enthusiast living their best life, grinding fresh beans at 7:30 a.m. Pretty standard stuff until a new neighbor moved in and decided that 30 seconds of coffee grinding was simply too much to bear.
Hmm. 7:30 a.m. seems well within reasonable hours for most apartment buildings, right?
Oh, absolutely reasonable. In fact, studies show that about 65% of Americans are already awake by 7:30 a.m., even on weekends. But this neighbor who works nights decided to skip the direct approach and went straight for passive-aggressive warfare.
Let me guess. The classic angry note under the door situation?
Exactly. Starting with, some people are trying to sleep, and escalating to formal noise complaints with the landlord. Research shows that passive-aggressive behavior like this actually increases conflict by about 40% compared to direct communication.
So, how did our coffee enthusiast respond to this escalating situation?
Well, that's where this story takes an unexpected turn. See, when the neighbor started banging on walls every time they used any kitchen appliance, our coffee lover revealed their secret weapon, opera training from college.
Now, that's what I call a plot twist. How exactly did they implement this musical revenge?
They began practicing scales and arias at 6 a.m. sharp, right when quiet hours end. And here's the brilliant part. When the neighbor complained, they simply said they were pursuing their passion. Studies show that early morning practice sessions are actually optimal for vocal training.
That's fascinating. Using the very rules meant to maintain peace to create what some might call artistic warfare. What happened next?
Well, after 3 weeks of morning concerts, they decided to level up by learning Wagner. Those epic German operas that can last up to 5 hours. The average Wagner piece is about 3.5 times longer than a standard opera.
That seems like quite an escalation from a 30-second coffee grind. How has this affected the broader apartment community?
You raise an interesting point. According to urban living studies, noise disputes account for about 27% of all neighbor complaints, but they're usually about late-night noise, not morning routines.
So, in a way, this situation has completely inverted the typical neighbor conflict pattern.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating is how this mirrors a growing trend in urban conflict resolution, where about 35% of disputes could be resolved with a simple conversation, but instead escalate into what mediators call creative retaliation.
That's quite telling about modern urban living. What lessons can we draw from this situation?
Well, behavioral psychologists suggest that passive-aggressive behavior often backfires, leading to what they call the escalation spiral. In this case, a 30-second annoyance turned into hours of operatic consequences.
Though I have to say, at least some good came out of it. They're improving their vocal skills.
That's true, and it reflects an interesting phenomenon psychologists call productive revenge, where people channel their frustration into self-improvement. Studies show about 23% of people actually develop new skills or hobbies as a result of conflict.
So, what you're saying is that sometimes the best revenge is personal growth?
Precisely, though I doubt the neighbor appreciates being the catalyst for this particular journey of self-improvement. Urban living experts suggest that noise complaints typically decrease by 60% when neighbors simply have one direct conversation.
It really makes you think about how many conflicts could be avoided with better communication.
And how sometimes the solution to a problem can create an even bigger issue. There's actually a term for this in conflict resolution studies, the amplification effect, where the response to a grievance creates more disruption than the original issue.
Well, in this case, it's certainly amplified from a coffee grinder to a full Wagner production.
And that's perhaps the ultimate irony. In trying to silence a 30-second morning routine, this neighbor essentially created their own personal opera house. Sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease, and
That's quite a way to learn about the importance of choosing your battles wisely.
indeed. And as we wrap up, let's remember that while this story is entertaining, it really highlights how modern urban living requires both communication skills and a good sense of perspective, or at least a appreciation for classical music.